Friends, in our last session, we stopped our discussion by referring to the consensual understanding of the origin of state. In this context, I would like to remind you that I have already mentioned that very broadly speaking, there are two different interpretations regarding the origin of state, or there are two different ways of looking at the origin of state. One is a consensual understanding, the other is a conflictual understanding. Now, in our last session, we have very broadly covered the different variations of the consensual understanding. In this particular session, we will focus on the conflictual understanding of the origin of state. Now, so far as the conflictual understanding relating to the origin of state is concerned, you can guess from your common sense that conflictual, that means conflict related understanding or explanation of state in the light of the notion of conflict that involves the idea of force or violence. And so far as political theory is concerned, there are two different phases involving this particular understanding. One is a very traditional understanding explaining the theory of or explaining the origin of state in the light of this element of force or violence. First, we will discuss this traditional understanding. Then, in recent years, especially since the 1970s, a new understanding of the role of force or violence in the understanding of state, in the explanation of the origin of state, has developed. Now, first of all, let us cover the traditional understanding. Now, the traditional understanding again may very broadly be divided into, say, two types. The first is a kind of explanation which may broadly be described as the psychological explanation. The psychological explanation argues that man is by nature instinctively violent, fierce, inclined to use force, and that in a way perhaps went into the making of the state itself being an expression of force, violence and might. So this is one explanation, that is a psychological explanation. There is, however, a larger explanation, a more convincing explanation, that is known as the historical explanation. It has been argued by many historians that if we look at the development of state right from, say, the earliest years of civilization, then we will find that the states as they have evolved in different parts of the world, say for example, if we look at the European experience, say the way the states developed in Norway, Sweden, Britain, Spain, then what we come across is that in all these regions, the states developed through clash, through conflict of different groups, different communities, different types of people. So it is this element of force, it is this element of violence which went into the making of state. So this is one explanation. That is, as I said, the traditional explanation can be divided into two categories. One is the psychological explanation, the other is the historical explanation. But so far as the historical explanation is concerned, well, this is one explanation, mainly provided by the historians. But there is a more sophisticated historical explanation which is generally known as the Marxian understanding, mainly associated with the names of Karl Marx and his companion Friedrich Engels. Now, the Marxian understanding suggests that state, well, it has been always an instrument of violence because state is based on the element of force. Now, why force went into the making of the state? The Marxian explanation is this, that human beings, when they began to be engaged in large-scale production with the help of more sophisticated tools, that is, as they improved the techniques of production, that led to surplus production. And eventually, the idea developed, this awareness developed in human society, that those who can grab the surplus, those who would be able to appropriate the surplus, well, they would be able to control society. That is, it is this appropriation of surplus which will lead to exercise of power. And for exercising power, you require an organization, you require a machinery, you require certain institutions. And this is how the state developed. So the state always has been an instrument of force and violence in the hands of those who appropriate the surplus. This has been, very broadly speaking, the typical Marxian understanding. Now, these explanations, I repeat, that is one the psychological, the other the historical. Well, these explanations are broadly known as the traditional explanations of the conflictual notion, the conflictual interpretation of the origin of state. But now I would like to make you familiar with more recent developments. These recent developments, very broadly speaking, developed in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, this emphasis on the understanding of state with reference to the element of force was developed by an American scholar. His name is Robert Carneiro. Robert Carneiro, in one of his articles, in fact he wrote a number of articles, then he came out with a number of books. Well, he developed a kind of explanation relating to the explanation of state, relating to the explanation of the origin of the state. And if one looks at his theory, then what one comes across is this: he totally outright dismisses the consensual understanding that the state was the result of a contract, that the state was the result of, say, a natural inclination of people to come together, etc., etc. This kind of understanding Carneiro totally dismisses, and in its place he develops an understanding which may broadly be, it may be put like this, which may broadly be explained as a kind of theory that is based on three different elements. The first element is that states arose where availability of agricultural land was scarce. That is, scarcity of agricultural land that led to clash, that led to conflict over possession of agricultural land. And that led to the idea of instituting a structure of power, that is the state. That is Carneiro's first explanation. The second factor with reference to which he tries to develop his theory is this. He argues that scarcity of resources, where you have scarcity of resources in the sense that is, you come across certain places where resources are concentrated. Now you have, say, several groups located in one place, several communities located in one particular place. And you know that resources are concentrated in a particular region. If you go out of that region, you do not have access to the resources which you require for your survival. So what begins in such a situation is a struggle for power over these concentrated resources, because resources are limited. Because of this limitation of resources, because of this restriction on the availability of the kind of resources that you are getting, what happens is it leads to struggle for power, it leads to conflict, it leads to tension, and that leads to the necessity of emergence of a structure of power. That is, those who can control the resources, they develop a power center, and this is how the state is born. The third is a demographic factor, that is pressure of population. That, according to Carnero, is the other point or the other factor explaining the rise of the state. Carnero's explanation is this, that if there is pressure of population in a particular place, then you require an order, because without an order there will be chaos. And for order, because without an order you cannot balance these problems, or you cannot say resolve the problems arising out of the pressure of population. So these are, very broadly speaking, the three factors identified by Carnero which went into the making of the state, which went into the birth of the state. Now, while developing this particular theory, Carnero actually questions the claims of at least two very leading theorists. One is a great British archaeologist, his name is Gordon Childe. The other is a German anthropologist come theorist, his name is Karl Wittfogel. Karl Wittfogel, in 1957, he developed a particular theory, and Gordon Childe, he also had developed a theory. These two theories are contested by Carnero. So far as Gordon Childe's explanation is concerned, he was an archaeologist. Now, his understanding was this, that yes, there was problem involving, say, conflicts between societies, between communities, over resources, etc., etc. But Childe's argument is this, that although there was an element of conflict, the element of conflict was overshadowed by the element of consensus, because people eventually settle down by being engaged in certain activities like, say, pottery, weaving, and through this division of labor, eventually human beings in society, this is all based, according to Childe, on archaeological evidences, that human beings ultimately resolved. Yes, there was the notion of conflict, all right, but eventually people felt, they more or less resolved, that without an element of integration, well, you cannot develop a proper order. So it is then ultimately an element of consensus, ultimately it is an element of integration, ultimately it is an element of cooperation, ultimately it is an element of mutual understanding, which resulted out of this collective involvement in work like pottery, fishery, that is different acts of division of labor. This led to neutralization of the element of force. This is Gordon Childe's explanation. But this is contested by Robert Carnero. The other point which I have already mentioned, that relates to Karl Wittfogel's understanding. Karl Wittfogel, in 1957, he came out with a book. Its name was Oriental Despotism. And in this book, Wittfogel actually developed a theory. It is commonly known as a theory of hydraulic society. That is, Wittfogel's understanding was this. And in fact, Gordon Childe also should be mentioned at this point, that the researches of Gordon Childe, the researches of Wittfogel, they were largely based not only on experiences of European societies, but also on the experiences of non-European societies. And Wittfogel, for example, introduced the idea that societies in the East, well, they more or less thrived, they more or less developed on the by using the element of cooperation. And this element of cooperation, this element of, say, collective engagement of labor, that was a result of what Carl Wittfogel describes as the large-scale irrigation structures. That is, irrigation was a contributory factor so far as development of Oriental societies is concerned. And to conduct, to organize, to coordinate this large-scale irrigation, which actually was which primarily went into the making of these societies, the sustenance of these societies in the East. Well, that led to the necessity of an order which will supervise these functioning of the irrigation structures. And this is how the state was developed. Now, Carnero points out that whatever be the evidences provided by Gordon Childe or Carl Wittfogel, say in countries like Mesopotamia, China, Mexico, state formations had already taken place before the commencement of large-scale irrigation. That is, contesting the claims of Wittfogel, he argues that the emergence of state, it has nothing to do with large-scale irrigation structures, which according to Wittfogel is the common characteristic of many non-European societies. This particular theory of Carnero, this is now known as the circumscription theory. This theory, however, as I said, this is a new kind of development, a new variety, a new kind of, say, variation of the notion of conflictual understanding of state. So, as I was saying, this particular theory of Carnero, which is known as circumscription theory, this theory was questioned. The claims of Carnero were contested by another scholar. His name was Elman Service. Elman Service, writing almost at the same time in the 1970s, contested the claims of Carnero. Elman Service's broad understanding is this. He argues that yes, there may be the role of conflict. Conflict, of course, was an important factor, but it was not the essential factor. It was not the crucial factor which went into the making of the state. Because he argues, and it's a very interesting argument, according to Elman Service, right from the very beginning, in the different communities, in the different groups, there was a kind of understanding that we have to maintain some kind of order in our society. That order in our society has to be maintained by obeying, by observing certain norms, certain rules, certain code of conduct. These norms, these rules, certain code of conduct, well, this is shared by the people living in that community. So there is a kind of consensus that if we have to live properly, if we have to survive properly, then we have to develop a kind of order which will be based on certain norms, certain values, certain principles, certain ideas shared by our community. This actually, Elman Service points out, was the foundation of law. Law is nothing but a code of conduct. And this code of conduct is something which is shared by the community. So according to Elm Service, this idea went into the making of the state. Eventually, when we come across the modern state with its institution of bureaucracy, law, etc., etc. Now, these things had their origins in the idea, rather in the awareness that we require certain institutions, we require certain principles, we require certain structures, with the help of which, or through the use of which, we will be able to observe certain norms, certain principles, and these norms, these principles will be shared by us, and that will lead to the sustenance of this order. It is this drive for an order, it is this drive for observance of certain norms, rules and principles through certain institutions that the notion of legality eventually developed, and this led to the birth of the modern state. So you can very easily understand that Carnero's position and Service's position, these two positions are quite conflicting. By way of concluding remarks, I would like to focus on two things. Number one, what we have so far done is we have tried to understand the way the state has been interpreted, the origin of the state has been interpreted by different theorists. But what we have to do now is this, and I think all of us are much more interested in that exercise, that is the way the state has developed in its present form. That is a modern state as we call it. Well, since this modern state was quite different from the way the state originated in its antiquity, so we have to understand how the state has assumed its modern shape. If that be so, then we have to trace the evolution of the state from the origins, from this antiquity to the present. And that means we have to highlight the past, because without understanding the past, we cannot understand the present. That is to understand how the modern state has evolved like this, how the modern state has emerged as a very powerful institution of force and violence. We have to go back to the past. That is, it's a long historical journey which is also extremely fascinating. So we have to undertake the journey, and that will be the focus of our attention in our next two sessions. So let us get ready for these next two sessions, where we will have to trace the evolution of the state from antiquity to the present. Thank you.